Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Black History and Racial Politics in America panel, sponsored by the Tarrant County College Connect campus, Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences. Before we begin, there's just a couple of quick things that I'd like to say. If you are attending this event for extra credit, at the end, we're going to send out a link to a short survey. This survey will record your attendance. So if you want extra credit, make sure that you fill out the survey at the end. Second, your participation is welcome. If you have any questions for our panelists, you can send us your questions at any time. You can find the chat by clicking on the little word bubble at the bottom of your screen. Toward the end, I'll relay as many of those questions to the panelists as I can. Lastly, there's a couple of thank yous that are in order. I'd like to first thank Misty Wilson Martins, our chair extraordinaire, and my colleague Sherry Mata for their work behind the scenes tonight. And also we'd like to thank our Dean and VP Candy Center and our President Dr. Morales for always making sure that we have the technologies that we do so that events like this can happen for TCC Connect students and for our community. I'm Anthony Squires, an Associate Professor of Government at Tarrant County College Connect campus, and I'm really excited to have two of the country's top political scientists working in the area of race and politics with us tonight. I've asked them to share their thoughts on the significance of politics to Black history and what they've learned about this subject from their own research in order to mark Black History Month and in order to use it as an opportunity to learn more about Black history and particularly Black political history, and how those histories have contributed to the present. With us are Dr. Lori Fraser Yokley, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her book, Racial and Ethnic Politics in American Suburbs, was the 2016 winner of the Best Book Award by the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section and the Dennis Judd Best Book Award by the Urban and Local Politics section of the American Political Science Association. She is joined by Dr. Shayla C. Nanally. Dr. Nanally is an Associate Professor in Political Science and at the Africana Studies Institute at the University of Connecticut. She is also the current president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists and author of the book Trust in Black America, Race, Discrimination, and Politics. She was awarded the Fannie Lou Hamer Award for Outstanding Community Service by the National Conference of Black Political Scientists in 2009. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Do either of you have a preference for starting? Should we stay with the alphabetical order?
Sure.
Whatever you like.
Yeah, why don't you start us off, Dr. Fraser Yokley?
Sure. Okay, I am going to take us over with a few slides, and so let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, and for slideshow, tell me if you see the entire show. Let me swap displays. What about now?
We see you right now.
You see me? Okay, sure.
Yes.
Let me just swap it back. What about now?
Somehow we still see you.
Okay, I'm working on it. I'm almost there. I'm still doing show entire screen. Okay, here we go. Share application.
There we go.
View entire screen. There we go. Allow screen one. Can you see it now?
Yes, we see it now.
You see the screen now? Okay. Which screen do you see? Do you see the slideshow from the beginning?
Uh, I think so. Race, gender, and electoral politics.
Right. Without the notes, Anthony.
I don't
Okay.
see any notes.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. All right, so first I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for planning such a great experience for us to come together and talk a little bit about Black politics and Black history for this great month. And I'm really pleased to be joined by the Shayla, who I've known forever also in the study of political science, and all the folks at Tarrant College who put this as follows. First, I'm going to note a few things about the changing demographics of the US electorate. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about race, ethnicity, and voter turnout, largely focusing on Black politics. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about race, gender, ethnicity, and vote choice, and some stark differences between our thinking about vote turnout and vote choice as it relates to Black politics. And next is implications and looking ahead, promising practices for upcoming elections. And in short, I want to end with what you can do as students in terms of looking ahead to the 2018 and 2020 election seasons. Okay, so that's where we're going. So first, race, ethnicity, and voter turnout. There have been some dramatic demographic changes and demographic shifts in the US electorate as it relates to racial and ethnic groups, particularly over the last couple of election cycles. In fact, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and other racial ethnic minorities account for about a third of voters in 2016, and this share of the electorate hasn't changed since 2020. In terms of white electoral turnout, they may, or share of the electorate, excuse me, they make consistently between 79 and 73% of the electoral share. So first looking at President Obama's last term in terms of race, ethnicity, and voter turnout in 2012 before we turn to 2016 and the Black vote. The number of white voters in 2012 dropped by 2 million in 2012, the first drop in absolute terms for any race or racial ethnic group since 1996. In fact, white turnout in Obama's first term. Latino voter turnout in terms of this part of the electorate are purported to be the fastest growing demographic group. But they make up a smaller share of eligible voters because many are not eligible to vote because they're non-citizens or they're not of voting eligible age yet. In 2012, Latino turnout dipped slightly from 49% in 2008 to 48% in 2012. And Asian American turnout has basically remained unchanged. Now, for Black voters in 2012, they were the only racial and ethnic group to show an increase in voter turnout in 2012. 66% of eligible Black voters cast a ballot in 2012, which was an increase from 2008. And Black voter turnout passed whites in 2012, increasing by 1.7 million voters between 2008 and 2012. Another interesting fact is that Black female voter turnout passed whites in 2008 and 2012. The next two figures just show you this graphically. This is turnout by race and ethnicity from 1996 to 2012, showing that Blacks in 2012, for the first time in history, outpaced the turnout of whites. Black female voter turnout outpaced white female voters in 2008 and 2012. However, Black voter turnout rates declined in 2016. This graph shows you the percentage of eligible voters who reported voting in 2016. And we see that Black voter turnout rates declined for the first time in 20 years in a presidential election, falling to 59.6% in 2016 after reaching its record high of 66% in 2012, and for the first time in history, outpacing the turnout rates of whites. So before we talk about a little bit of implications, I'm going to add something else to the mix. So before we talk about implications of that and sort of looking forward, and that is about race, ethnicity, gender, and vote choice, right? So it's not enough when you talk about Black politics or racial ethnic politics for that matter, to just focus on a group's propensity to turn out to vote at the ballot box or via early voting, so on and so forth, but actually who the candidate chose. And particularly in 2016, the role of race, ethnicity, and gender played a prominent role. The 2016 election reinforced the long-standing presence of the so-called gender gap. What's the gender gap? The gender gap is the difference between men and women in support of the winning candidate, showing an overall support. When we look at all women versus all men, an overall stronger support among women voters who are women voters for the Democratic Party candidate, who we know was Hillary Clinton. However, if we look a little bit closer and we dig a little bit deeper into the so-called gender gap, we do know that there are stark differences along the lines of race, ethnicity, and gender. When we look at white women voters in 2008, 2012, and 2016, we know that they voted in the majorities for the Republican candidate. In fact, the percentage of white women who voted for the Democratic Party candidate between 1952 and 2012 shows that white women only voted in the majorities for the Democratic Party candidate twice since 1952. And in fact, the American National Election Study just started collecting these figures in 52. So this is kind of our earliest data. 1964 and 1996 were the two times. Well, what about other racial and ethnic groups? What this distinction shows here is that Black women have remained the stalwart of the Democratic Party, being Democratic Party loyalists. So when we think through some of the implications of the so-called gender vote, many scholars contend that the gender vote is in fact driven by racial and gender disparities in voting in elections and vote choice, with specific differences between white women, Black women, and other women of color. This data comes from a survey that we launched and that Shayla actually the Collaborative Post-Election Survey in 2016. And this shows all women voters and their vote choice by race in 2016. And it shows that Black women favor Clinton at 93%, Latinas at 82%, Asian women at 79%, and white women at 46%. This is an interesting slide to also note that while there was a high number among racial ethnic minority groups in terms of their turnout and their vote choice for the Democratic candidate, that we see something very different when we look at their favorability scores, right? So while Black women favored Hillary Clinton around 93% in terms of turning out to vote for her, in turning out to vote for Hillary Clinton at 93%, they didn't favor her at those rates. In fact, it barely touched the 80% mark in terms of their favorability towards Clinton. And so what many scholars suggest here is that at least for African American women who turned out to vote for Hillary Clinton, it wasn't necessarily because they favored the candidate at those same levels, but in many ways they held their nose and voted for her anyway. So now let's turn to a few implications and also look forward towards what we can do as a society and as students and as faculty in terms of moving forward as we look to 2018 and 2020. Well, first, one of the implications of showing the racial ethnic differences and really the change in voter turnout rates for African Americans in our most recent elections, and then moving to look at disparities and differences in vote choice between our two major parties, particularly among women, we have a few implications. In recent elections, great attention has been paid to the so-called gender gap, the youth vote, and also particularly Latino mobilization and turnout. However, Black voter turnout and vote choice remains largely overlooked. and seen as a no-brainer. In fact, if Blacks turn out at all, they would overwhelmingly choose the Democrat. So why do we put resources and funding into learning more about the implications of voter turnout and vote choice among the Black electorate, particularly among Black women? But we do know from the figures that I showed you today and research that's being undertaken by both Shayla and I, voter turnout and vote choice are not equal. And that this 7% dip in Black voter turnout actually had an implication, and it will continue to have implications if this group is not mobilized. Those with higher, we do know from existing literature that those with higher socioeconomic status are more likely to participate, in part because they are more likely to be recruited to participate, asked to participate, more likely to be mobilized to participate, particularly by political parties. And as students and scholars, you may think, well, why is that? And if just think about if you were a campaign official and your job is to rally the vote, you're going to spend your time focusing on so-called high propensity voters, those voters who have a history of turning out to vote for a particular party. And if that history is such that they vote largely for the Democratic Party, then you might spend your scarce resources in mobilizing other kinds of groups, both high propensity and those who you want to muster a vote, a larger vote for. Previous research confirms that people of color are disproportionately less likely to be asked to participate by politicians and activists. They are less likely to be contacted by whites to vote. Individuals of lesser social status or lower socioeconomic status are forced to rely on political mobilization of community-based groups, community organizing, more heavily than individuals with greater or higher socioeconomic status. Now, some implications to tie this to race, gender, and vote choice is that most existing studies view gender differences on vote choice that are undifferentiated by race and ethnicity. So for political pundits on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, when we think about the recent election in 2016, or even the more recent election of Roy Moore, we sort of have to press folks to disaggregate, to separate our discussions about gender and the women's vote by also gender and race and ethnicity. Because this has some problems if we fail to do so. It obscures substantial differences among women voters, particularly by race and ethnicity, but also class and sexuality and where they live and a variety of other kinds of indicators. White women consistently behave politically. You know that historically this is the case, only having voted for the Democratic Party in the majorities 2 times since 1952. So I'm arguing that research should take an intersectional approach, particularly in presidential politics, but at the local, state, and national level, for a more nuanced view of race, ethnicity, gender, as well as sexuality, national origin, and other identities in the study of politics in the US. And so the study of intersectionality originated, in fact, in the field of law and originally focused on the study of Black women. It flourished broadly in the field of public policy and psychology and other social sciences, particularly political science and sociology. So we must continue to promote and examine a few efforts in terms of what we can do as a community and as students and scholars as we look to 2018 and 2020. So I'm going to conclude with a few promising practices, and they relate to voter registration efforts, get out the vote. For example, we saw stark declines in the ability of folks to utilize mobilization tools like Souls to the Polls and Sisters to the Polls, which proved in practice great in terms of registering folks to vote, but then also getting them out to the polls on election day. We also need to focus our attention as students and scholars on electoral reform, remembering that the Shelby County versus Holder decision around Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act is something that we still need to keep to the fore. Voter ID laws, trimming of early voting days, voting line disparities and wait times, and voter suppression tactics are real. Now, a couple of promising practices as I close. One relates to personal contacting. Studies suggest that door-to-door or face-to-face interactions have demonstrated their effectiveness in encouraging people of color to become more civically and politically motivated and to get involved. People of the same racial ethnic group have been shown to be better at contacting those of the same race and ethnicity. And in some, asking people to participate and giving them a reason to do so results in higher rates of civic and political participation. Now, what about youth targeting? Voting is very habitual. Those who do it are more likely to do it again, and that's one of the great reasons for focusing on youth. Given the disproportionate share of young people in communities of color, efforts specifically targeted towards the youth have been shown promising, particularly the work of those by Kathy Cohen and others at the University of Chicago. Incorporating youth opinions on decisions that affect them, promote their involvement, and providing financial assistance to encourage high school and college-age community-wide problems. Providing opportunities for youth to work in the electoral politics arena, like canvassers, representatives, and spokespersons. And as a final slide, a couple of best practices or promising practices in terms of community service and outreach. Past organizing has demonstrated that meeting people, quote, where they are, that is focusing on a local issue that's already important to many folks and important to the quality of life that they have in their communities, is the first step in getting people politically involved. It's something where you can take on small wins to build up to something bigger. Successful mobilization by finding consensus rather than creating it. And that's what we can do by starting with smaller, more localized issues. Successful work around a specific issue can then be used to move on to larger, more complex issues at the local, state, and federal level. And what I want to part with here and on my last slide is that don't wait to share what you've learned at your college. You have acquired knowledge that people wish they had an opportunity to sit in your seats or at your computer. So I encourage you to get out there, because we all can educate, and you don't have to have a doctor in front of your name in order to do so. You can take the knowledge from the papers that you're writing to share that information with community-based. Who simply don't have the time and resources to get the kind of knowledge that you're getting at your college now. And so I just want to encourage you to share the knowledge that you have in many creative ways and get on out there, because we all can educate. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nanali?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Actually, I think this is a really good order that we have chosen as far as our discussion today, because Dr. Fraser-Yoakley discussed contemporary politics as far as race and politics. And although I do work in public opinion and political behavior and also analyze survey data, as she mentioned, I also find my interest in political science veering towards history, and in particular, African American political history. And so some of what Dr. Fraser-Yoakley presented to you has some historical context as far as why we see Black political behavior develop the way that it has, but also increasingly as we're seeing pundits refer to history as well as other groups' behavior through the lens of race. So I start by stating that, in part, my interest in African American political history rests in understanding the relationship that Black Americans have had with the political system over time, and that is pretty much since the inception of the nation. If you will, take a step back and think about the institution of slavery and how it defined, in essence, what was the Black body at that time. As I speak about politics now, I'm considering the conditions of a group of people who at that time, despite their acknowledging their own humanity, were recognized as property. And thus, in that context of being recognized as property, there's a struggle over time for them to assert their humanity and eventually become incorporated into the American political system as not only human beings, but also citizens. Hence, we know the Civil War and what the Civil War meant for fighting the institution of slavery, but also what occurred as far as constitutional change and incorporating Black Americans as U.S. citizens. So in 1865, yes, we see the abolition of slavery. And in 1868, yes, in 1865, we see the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment. And in 1868, we see the introduction of citizenship for African Americans by way of the 14th Amendment. And eventually we see that Black men acquired the right to vote in 1870. Nonetheless, that period of Reconstruction from 1865 through 1877 becomes one where we see that there's an expansion of civil rights and actual citizenship for Black Americans. But thereafter, we find that there is critical political change. How does that occur? Because we see that there's increasingly a return to some of the behaviors and practices that more or less treated Black Americans similarly to what they were in the institution of slavery. And that is by way of the institution of Jim Crow. So especially in the context of the American South, we see that Black Americans are then reconstituted as persons, not only as citizens, but as second-class citizens. So that means that their rights are not necessarily recognized as full citizens. What that meant as far as the political power that Black Americans had acquired initially by way of Reconstruction era was that they had great political power as far as being able to determine elections in a Southern environment where the white political vote was fractured. So we see that in Black Americans as early as the 1860s, 1870s, had a loyalty to the Republican Party at that time because that party was a party that thought that slavery was a wrong. And so as Black Americans developed that loyalty to that party, they also voted in that way. And because there was a fissure between whites as far as the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the South, nonetheless, Black Americans' loyal vote to the Republican Party helped the Republican Party win numerous elections in the South during that time. So this is why it became important for disfranchisement to occur in the political interest of whites in the South who wanted to make sure that Southern living could return to the way that it was during the institution of slavery. And that was, as it was framed, in the context of white supremacy, and also returning society in similar ways to what it was during the institution of slavery. So when we see by way of a presidential election in 1876 that the candidate then decides that one way he would win a tie in that race with Samuel Tilden and then Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican candidate, Tilden, the Democratic candidate, Hayes, the Republican candidate, makes a compromise such that he negotiates with Southern legislators and tells them that he will remove troops from the South such that the South can eventually return to the way that it was during slavery. With that end of Reconstruction as we knew it, by way of that compromise of 1877, it is here that we see that Southern society changes. Not only is it the end of Reconstruction, but also, as I mentioned, you see that there is this eventual return of Black Americans to a second-class status in a way that was symbolic in ways of the institution of slavery. Disfranchisement laws appeared in state constitutions across the South, but part of that control was also concerted because of the interest in redeeming the South in a pattern that it once knew and a power within the institution of slavery. So this is why we hear the struggle for the right to vote over time for Black Americans that lasts almost 100 years, leading into what was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which you heard Dr. Fraser Yoakley even mention as far as its significance with respect to the Sheldon v. Holder case, because Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was more or less dismantled by this new policy from that U.S. Supreme Court case in 2013. So hopefully you can hear some of these linkages that have been made over time as far as the construction of what we call the construction of the Black body, but also the way that the Black body has been treated in being considered less than a full human being, but also second-class citizenship status. But as I mentioned that the Republican Party had been a party to which Black Americans had been loyal, we see increasingly in the 1930s, by way of social welfare policies and an attempt by Franklin D. Roosevelt to also build some connection to Black Americans, that there was some change in how Black Americans voted, those Black Americans who still retained the right to vote, especially Black Americans who lived in the American North. And so they increasingly became Democratic. But it was not until 1964 that we see that connection to the Democratic Party became even more consolidated. And so once that connection to the Democratic Party became consolidated in 1964, you might ask, how so? Lyndon Baines Johnson and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which more or less provided equal access to public accommodations, not only for Black Americans, but many people of color across the United States. It is also here that we have since seen African Americans be devoted, if you will, as much as 90% of its voters then voting for the Democratic Party. So what I hope you hear is an illustration of the connection between race and party politics over time, and what this is meant for not only African American political history, but if you will, thinking about Southern political history and also the greater context of that history in American politics. But it just doesn't stop there. So as far as my interests and some of my research interests that I'm now considering, I am interested in what is known as African American political development. And that is how African Americans developed their political awareness, their political activism over time. So as I mentioned to you, while I had some interest in survey research analysis, now I'm venturing more into other kinds of data where you can actually look at archives, documents that might be 100 years old, and see people's names and how they wrote to one another and describe their political interests, describe what they wanted to do in order to mobilize people. But also think about ways that I could collect data by interviewing people who may have had experiences decades ago and have them share them with me so that I can understand a different political era. How does that relate to what I am doing now? Well, now I have an interest in African American political history as far as education. So you're probably wondering, how does education become political? Well, yes, you probably have seen, even by way of your own personal experiences in your school systems, that education is a part of politics all the time. And at least from what I have determined in my investigation of African Americans' experiences with education, that has been quite a struggle, in part because of this group that, as I described to you, had been recognized as property. And that because it was recognized as property, historically, there was actually a struggle in order to contest being thought of as property and being able to acquire an education. At some point in American political history, we find that many states actually outlawed and prohibited enslaved as well as actually freed persons from learning in learning in education institutions. So when literacy is banned from people, it then became a special interest post-Civil War, when Black Americans acquired citizenship and acquired equality, if you will, at that time, that they'd be able to develop their own schools and have an education. This was debated as far as what kind of education that would be. Probably a debate that you may have heard of in some of your classes. Some of part of that debate related to whether or not there should be an industrial education, as we find by way of Booker T. Washington, a Black political philosopher who was formerly enslaved himself and absconded to freedom and was self-taught and also learned at a historically Black institution today, Hampton University, then Hampton Institute. But also as he debated what that curriculum would be for Black Americans as far as W.E.B. Du Bois, and thinking that maybe Black Americans can have what is known as a classical liberal education, where they can have free ideas and be able to explore all kinds of disciplines. But it wasn't just that. Part of that debate related to the extent to which people, and in particular white society, thought about the construction of, again, the Black body and whether or not there was indeed intellectualism. As much as this sounds sad for today, we have people debating the intelligence of various racial groups based upon racial theory, what was known as scientific racism. And so some of that scientific racism actually poured into the debates about the extent to which Black Americans could even be educated once they did acquire their access to citizenship and freedom. And so what it meant for Black Americans to acquire beyond even a rudimentary education in elementary school and moving especially into secondary education and hence high schools and beyond and universities was a battle against the way that their minds were believed to be inferior compared to, in particular, whites. Some of what became an ideology that was expressed in all and every aspect of society in the 19th century, especially in the latter 1800s and the early 1900s. You've probably heard of eugenics. Regretfully, eugenics actually incorporated this notion of science and suggested that there were differences in the races based upon based upon biology, and that because of that, those groups should be treated differently, public policy should be applied to them differently, and also, as we have learned by way of policy, that people were actually sterilized to prevent them from procreating or more or less having children for generations. What that meant for how we think about not only Black intellectualism, but also the way that Black people are incorporated into society, as well as other non-white groups, I hope you hear, has some influence on the way that then these groups are thought about in different aspects of society. So, in linking political history with what I have an interest in as far as education and exploring how the Black body was defined over time and what that means for even how Black Americans experience education in the context of the Jim Crow era, when we know that schools, especially in the South, were segregated based on race, I then find an interest in determining what were some of those debates that occurred during those decades. How did Black Americans respond to being perceived in that way? How did they respond, believe it or not, fresh out of slavery? Some people actually use their pensions, actually Union soldiers, Black Union soldiers, use their pensions to save money and help build, actually build by their hands and also resource materials for schools that otherwise were not supported by state funds. So, in the interest of time, in linking all of this together, well, we see that we can also have an analysis of, for example, contemporary Black political issues. We also see that contemporary Black political issues might have some relevance as far as understanding what preceded them and how American political history, and in particular Black political history, might inform the way that people think about politics today. And as I have described it, part of that research interest that I have now is understanding how people were constructed, as we call it, by way of race, race being a social construction and not rooted in biology, and then what that entailed for how Black people were treated over time and in their ability to acquire an education, as it was perceived that they did not have the capacity to be able to acquire an education. That links theory. That also links as well some qualitative data that we can use to be able to analyze how people come to understand their what we call place in society. I'll stop right here to entertain any questions that you may have later about what I mentioned, but hopefully you can hear the way in which history can possibly inform the way that people think about their identities, think about their politics, and importantly, their interactions with their political system in a way that can move them more and more closer to liberation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Those are outstanding presentations. I just want to remind anybody in the audience, if you have questions, that you can put those in. But before that, I kind of have two questions for our panelists, kind of big picture. And let's start, I think, with you, Dr. Fraser-Yokely. I guess the question I have for you, you did a nice job explaining some of the current trends in Black politics, and that's where your research interest lies. And I imagine that you have lots of future plans and research that you think about, and if you're like me, you probably have more than you could ever do in a lifetime. But with that sort of forward-thinking kind of mindset, what are the questions about Black politics today or historically that we don't have answers to yet? And why is it important that we look for the answers? We can't quite hear you.
How about now?
Yes, now we can hear you. There you go.
Okay, and the PowerPoint came through clear. I was reading through the notes just to make sure that no one said they couldn't see it. So I'm just making sure that when I piggyback on something that everyone can see the presentation from previously.
Yes, we saw it just fine.
Okay, great. All right, so the reason why I thought it best to introduce some contemporary voter turnout issues, and then with regards to vote choice, is because we are very much at a very critical time. The 2016 election was consequential for Black Americans and for the study of Black politics, and our relationship to the Democratic Party. Which direction will the Democratic Party take with regards to the Black electorate? And I'm particularly interested in the role of Black women, and whether or not the Democratic Party will position the interests of Black women to the fore with regards to organizing, with regards to mobilization, and with regards to learning more about the needs and concerns of the Black community, particularly because we have proven to be such a loyal and a strong stalwart of the Democratic Party. So with regards to gender and politics, I think that there's a lot of unanswered questions as it relates to Black folks' position in the Democratic Party, and whether that's just lip service or the extent to which Black voters will be mobilized, and also the needs to vote, or who are not eligible to vote because they've been disenfranchised for a number of reasons, whether incarcerated or other kinds of means of not being able to join in the electorate. So whether or not the needs and concerns of Black folks will be positioned within our two-party system. And then if not, what other kind of avenues might there be? So that's one of the pressing policy issues. One of the other things, just to close this, addressing your inquiry, is there are a number of public policy issues, whether that's the views towards the ACA or Obamacare, views towards federal spending, views towards a variety of policy issues related to gun control and other kinds of policy issues, where there are stark differences by race and gender that need to be addressed. And they aren't necessarily what one might think that fall along the lines of specifically support for the Democratic Party. And so the reason why we need to address these concerns by race and gender, taking an intersectional approach in doing so, is that we're better able as teachers, as scholars, as students to understand not just these disparate roles by either gender or race, but how they intersect the Black community along the lines of race and class and sexuality, wealth and income, and a variety of things. And if we continue to take these things separately, right, these issues separately, then I think that's to our peril.
Great. Dr. Denali, I have a question for you. So you talked a lot about education and African American education, and I think through our correspondence, I hit on the fact that we have a mutual desire to see more African American scholarship in political science and history as well. So I was wondering if you could explain to us why this is a desirable goal, and then sort of going along with that, do you feel that the African American perspective brings something to the study of politics and history? And if so, what would that be?
Okay. So one thing I think that is very important to acknowledge, as far as, if I am recalling correctly, by way of your question, Dr. Squires, is the notion of how our society, quite honestly, historically, had been exclusive. And we question what that means, and in particular, racially exclusive, as far as people having equal access to education. And what that has meant over time, as far as suppressing the numbers of people of African descent who would have access to education to also be able to be a part of, I guess, the scholarship that is produced about Black people. So that's one, to acknowledge that. And that two, that is a continuing project we have, for example, even by way of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, that we have an interest in making sure that in some way we assist in helping Black scholars be able to professionally develop to actually become the writers, the professors who are part of producing knowledge about Black people. Mm-hmm. What does that also then mean for the scholarship production about Black people? Well, I do think that there are some sensitivities that allow for a specific lens that we may not have if someone is from a different background. Not to say that this would be exclusive of those persons having that perspective. But if I might say this, that as far as thinking about the project that I am currently interested, I think I have some connectivity to it, in part because I am a Black American whose parents actually attended Jim Crow segregated schools. And so I developed my interest in understanding Jim Crow segregated schools by way of them telling me about their experiences. So in some ways, in hearing what they said about what they experienced, it also helped me to think about the questions that I produce in a certain way that I think I'm not quite sure I would know unless I were to investigate it by way of reading in other texts. So even what it means to have that knowledge production about Black people, I think that is important to make sure that we do have people who have those experiences, who can ask those questions that might be sensitive to their own personal experiences by way of also being members of that group. And that goes for not only people of African descent, but various groups, and especially what we find for what that means for underrepresented groups over time, in part because we have seen that part of this exclusion as far as access to education has not only been exclusion as far as access to education, but if you will, also exclusion as far as being subjects of research, subjects for which we write about and come to understand, which I greatly appreciate Dr. Fraser-Yoakley mentioning intersectionality and how we need to think about what we do as scholars in analyzing our data to actually tease out a little bit more as far as other than what we had already made conventional knowledge in studying race or gender separately. That we actually can look at the two and discover new information that we had not considered previously.
We're going to take a question from the audience now. Someone in our audience is asking, should African American women protest the Democratic Party by either joining a third party or, I guess, supporting independent candidates to prove their value? And then they go on to say, if Democrats felt threatened that African American women would leave, would they be more supportive of issues that African American women want to see?
Shayla, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go?
How would I tackle this? I could.
Go ahead,
Don't worry, I
Shayla.
could. Okay. Um,
I'm
well,
sure we both
I
have
think
a lot to say about this as Black women, and it's such a
that's right.
double-edged sword, right? So yeah, go ahead, Shayla.
We'll,
I
we'll hear
agree.
both of your thoughts.
But so I really think that the Democratic Party for a long time has tried not to acknowledge the fact that at base, Black people were indeed its base. This is just without even acknowledging gender, right? And so, what is meant for the party to then try to court voters, although it may not openly say this, at least in our political science research, especially as far as race and political parties, we find instances where the Democratic Party has attempted to court, in particular, white voters, in order to attempt to win elections. But as Dr. Fraser-Yokely mentioned, that our electorate is becoming increasingly diverse, if you think about it, part of that diversity also is similar to what I described as far as what happened during Reconstruction era, where we see that the white vote was divided and that Black Americans, by voting for one particular party, and at that time Republican Party, were able to decide the elections. We're almost at that point now in the white vote being divided the way that it is, and that we find that Asian Americans, as well as Latinx and African Americans, are more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. What does that mean as far as Black women? Well, I think yet again, the party has not recognized the extent to which, in essence, in 2012 and 2016, Black women were the group that helped that party to achieve the numbers that it did. So in order for it to understand how it can think about an election in 2020, for example, for a presidential election, it really will have to think about how it configures its party politics, because of what I described as far as the white vote being divided. And in particular, what we find that white women actually became more Republican in those years as well, in 2008 through 2016. And we also see that there was a difference in education level and what that meant for white women, also supporting the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. So there are these various intersections for these several groups that I think the Democratic Party especially needs to complicate a little bit more as far as the message that it attempts to develop for the public in order for it to process who it will vote for in its elections. Now, I know that I may have incorporated several other groups in that answer about how the Democratic Party should think about Black women, but I really do think that it has not thought about Black women enough to understand that their turnout and the extent of their participation really has made a difference in elections, and especially in 2012, where we see that women were more supportive of the Obama candidacy. It actually was, in particular, Black women who were more supportive at that point. And this is where we see that change in that behavior in a way that I think is going to be lasting as far as who we see turn out and make a difference in elections. Dr. Fraser.
Let me switch if you don't mind. Let me switch the topic, because we have a very interesting question here from one of the students. They want to know if you feel being an African American woman in academia adds additional pressures to you.
Oh, I guess I'll start with this one. And I'm going to sneak in. I'm going to take presenter privilege, Dr. Squires. I'm sorry, Dr. Squires, and just answer really quickly the other one, like 30 seconds or less.
Go ahead.
In terms of the norm, and this bleeds into the second question as well, the second student's question, which is an excellent question. We ponder that all the time, right? So, but it's the normative view, the view about what Black women should do. Should they defect, and switch parties, right? Or should they stay home and not vote at all, right? Hold out, hold their vote. But the Black community, particularly and arguably among Black women, have been very much community serving. So how does my vote, like oftentimes when we cast a ballot, and I am speaking in generalities here from other Black women in my community and in my household, that you're not just voting for yourself, but oftentimes taking that you're voting for those who can't vote for themselves, those who can't stand online, those who didn't have the opportunity to vote. So for example, when I voted in 2016, my dad passed away in 2014, I'm casting a ballot, not just for myself, but for my community. And not so much that I believe that the Democratic Party has all the answers, but that holistic approach is also very pragmatic. So the slide I showed you that sort of looked at women's support for Clinton, Trump, and the other folks, Johnson, Stein, and other candidates. Arguably, those women who cast the ballot for Johnson, Stein, and other candidates, and we are in a two-party system, let's be very clear here. Those candidates had no chance of winning in 2016. So you may not like to hear the pragmatic nature of the vote, but when you cast a ballot for another group, it's a zero-sum game here. Then within the two-party system, that vote doesn't go to Trump or Clinton, obviously. And so again, with it being such a tight race, particularly in the battleground states, Black women votes mattered. And so for those who switched to another party as a protest vote, or they held their vote and stayed home, it had negative implications for what we see right now. So that's not the best answer, but I truly believe, and the data shows us that Black women are communal in their voting patterns in many ways, and also very pragmatic at the same time. So you can be both normatively and sort of communal and also pragmatic. So how that bleeds into the second question, which I think is an excellent question, and I'm also in, because I know we are, this might be my last time to address you guys, is that I am first generation college, right? So I had no idea that I would be the first woman of color to be on a tenure track or to earn tenure and promotion in the political science department at UCLA. So not just the first woman of color, but the first Black woman. So in my imagination growing up as a little Black girl on the south side of Chicago, this wasn't even in my imagination. My father only finished the 8th grade and my mother high school. And so this whole trajectory of getting here and being able to, be invited to speak to colleges and universities and present my work and to raise money to do the kind of work that I do, and to publish research wasn't a part of my imagination as a Black female. But I do know in this space, and it's my job to continue to encourage folks like you. So when I say the papers that you're writing in your classes and the work that you're doing in your classes, you can't hold on to it. You have to sort of figure out how to make sure you're making yourself useful, even at the undergraduate level, and working with community-based groups and working with other organizations who simply don't have the time to sit down and do research, because they're putting out fires every day in their communities as community leaders. And so even if you come from a low-income background, or you are first generation, or you're undocumented, or you have are some other group that has been marginalized, is that I hope you look to Shayla and I for inspiration to say that it really doesn't matter where you come from, but it will matter what you plan to do with your college education and moving forward.
Thank you. That was an amazing panel for both of you. Let's thank our presenters. Fantastic. Well, that's it for tonight. Thank you all for coming to our Black History Month event. I think it was a fantastic event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.